Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Goodness. You committed genocide against our people. Give us what you stole from us, our bones, our skulls, our babies, our people. You destroyed our land. Give us a treaty. We want a treaty. Outburst of an Indigenous Senator, Lydia Thorpe, when the British Royal visited Australia's Parliament. It may be a radical move, but does this align somehow with the Australian government's directions? You have shown great respect for Australians even during times when we have debated the future of our own constitutional arrangement and the nature of our relationship with the Crown. Nothing stands still, said the Prime Minister of Australia. Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, who wants the country to become a republic with an Australian head of state, made an oblique reference to the issue in his speech welcoming the monarch. Is this the slow death of the British monarchy? On the other hand, people have had haircuts, people have shined shoes, suits have been pressed, and that's just the Republicans, said the opposition leader Peter Dutton, who wants to keep the British King as the Australia's head of state. Further said that many supporters of Republic were honoured to attend a reception for the Charles and Queen Camilla at Parliament House. But it is important to note, Australia's six-state government signalled their support for an Australian head of state by declining invitation to the reception. Well, before all of this, the Australian Republic movement, which wants Australia to break away its constitutional ties with Britain, wrote to Charles requesting a meeting in Australia in his visit, and for the King to advocate their cause. Buckingham Palace wrote back to say King's meeting would be decided upon by the Australian government. Observers say a meeting did not appear on the official itinerary. Whether Australia becomes a republic is a matter for the Australian public to decide, stated by the Buckingham Palace in their response to the Australian Republic movement. Let's look back at the history of Australia. How did it look prior to the arrival of Europeans? It is reported at least 60,000 years ago, before Christ, the area that became as a New South Wales, where the first European settlement took place, was inhabited entirely by the Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, with traditional social legal organization and land rights. Aboriginal people had occupied and utilized the entire continent and adapted successfully to a large range of ecological and climatic conditions, from wet temperature and tropical rainforests to extremely arid deserts. It was estimated Aboriginal populations varied between 300,000 to 1 million. More than 200 different Aboriginal languages were spoken, and there were hundreds of dialects was used. Most Aboriginal people were bilingual or multilingual. The largest entities recognized by the people were the languaged groups, or you call it the tribes. There may have been about 500 such named territorially anchored groups. Tribe members shared cultural features and interacted more with one another than with members of different groups. These groups were not, however, political or economic entities. And while language names may have been commonly used by groups as labels for one another, individual and group identity was grounded in much more locally oriented affiliations and membership. Who was the head of the people and the tribe? Aboriginal people had no chiefs or other centralized institutions of social or political control. This now leaves you with a question. How were they expected to adapt to a Westminster system which was later brought in by the British and the head of state model? For the Aboriginal people, the maintenance of law and order was quite narrowly localized. The authority was limited and qualified by kinship claims. Precedents were sought in order to guide or influence action resulting from a breach. And all societies followed approved procedures for maintaining the peace. There were no judicial bodies as such in most clans. Their nomadic way of life was a direct result of a major limitation of the hunter-gatherer economy. Their certainty of reduced food volume and an even greater expenditure of effort to obtain it the longer the group stayed in one place. They had to intimately acquainted with all the country within the range of movement and possess a detailed knowledge of the location, distribution, the characteristic of its waterholes, fauna, flora, and the climate condition. The ability to read the ground like a map greatly improved their efficiency as hunters. Knowledge of the topography and resources of huge areas of the country was also gained through religion, which related closely to their economic life. As valuable as secular law was, it was of a lower order in Aboriginal people's worldwide view than religious knowledge. Aboriginal peoples believed that the dreaming legacy gave them the responsibility for the control over the fertility and reproduction of the plants, the animals, and that it was therefore only through the use of ritual and resources were replenished and social life could continue. The heavy responsibility was claimed by senior males through all adults shared in the maintenance of the land and its resources through ritual participation and obedience to the law. So, did they move from place to place or stayed stable? They moved. They used two basic patterns of movement to move through the land. In fertile regions, there were well-established camping areas close to water and having important methodological association, where people always camped at certain times of the year. Camps were bases from which people made ventures into the surrounding bush for food, returning in the late afternoon or spending a few days away. The second pattern involved in much larger territory, in arid or the desert areas, which Aboriginal people moved in small family groups, from waterhole to waterhole along well-defined tracks. The whole camp moved and rarely established bases. Only in good seasons and at a sizable permanent waters is possible for a large number of people to remain for an extended period. With the movement, how did they manage their material possession? Material objects were minimal for them. They used multi-purpose tools such as digging stick or spear, were light-weighted and portable. Appliances such as the last base stones on which food or ochre was ground were left at the site and used whenever groups were in the vicinity. Instant tools such as the stone pounders or the grass cushion used by women when carrying heavy loads or wooden dishes on their heads were fashioned as needed from raw materials available close at hand. So how did the division of labor look like? The major division of labor was sex-based. Men and youth mostly hunted large game, like large prey. Women collected vegetable foods and hunted small game such as lizards. However, adults of one sex could easily subsist for a long period without members of the other. For example, when men absented themselves from their brand to undertake journeys related to religious concern, all adults of such each sex normally possessed the full range of skills acquired for getting a living. The structure of men and women in the society, how did it look like? Men's obligations were generally wider than those of women. They included payment in meat for ritual knowledge until the achievement of senior status, and wisdom earned them roles as directors of rituals and guardians of scared objects and law. Food gathered by women was not usually shared throughout the band, whereas large game like the biggest hunt was always butchered and distributed to all members according to conventions surrounding a man's kinship obligation. In most of Australia, women provided the major proportion of the food consumed, about 60 to 80% depending on area and season. Women were the major childminders. Through children often played the farragged of groups and snacked on food they obtained. As girls approached their teens, they were expected to become providers, while boys had few responsibilities until initiation began. Aboriginal economy? Did such thing exist? Yes, there were no markets. Promotion of intergroup harmony and alliance was generally the primary goal. The nomadic culture allowed no place for the accumulation of material goods, nor was there any attempt to link status or prestige to the possession of objects. The dominant Aboriginal values were unselfishness and the dutiful discharge of kinship and religious obligations. In gift exchanges, especially, the emphasis centered on the social bond being reinforced rather than on the objects being transferred. Scarce goods such as boomerangs, pearl shells from Kimberleys, passed along defined routes from one group to another in an intricate pattern that crisscrossed the continent. So did they challenge the way of living? Aboriginal people saw their way of life as already ordained by the creative acts of the dreaming beings and the blueprint that was their legacy. So their mission was simply to live in agreement with the terms of that legacy. There was thus no notion of progress and no room for competition, dogmas, or rebellion against the status quo. Everything that now existed was fixed for all time in the mythic past, and all that the living were asked to do in order to guarantee the continuance of their world was obey the law of the dreaming and perform correctly the rituals upon which physical and social reproduction was said to depend. Human creativity was not excluded but was explained away. The view of the world gave precedence to spiritual powers and explanation over mundane knowledge or human intellect, and it placed everyone squarely under the authority of the law rather than that of other people. Aboriginal people were consistently surrounded by proofs of the existence and the power of spiritual forces. The landscape itself was a dominant representation of the dreaming reality, and their everyday activities were in large measures a reenactment of those of the creative beings, making religion indivisible from the mundane concerns of daily life. Outside the ritual arena, and notwithstanding the superior rights of men over women and of the older men over younger men, people valued their personal autonomy highly and were likely to react with anger and violence to any attempts by others to deny or diminish it. Now, the European enters Australia. Australia became part of the British colonies from 1788, founded solely to house convicts. The first fleet of 11 convict ships set sail, arriving in 1788, by the way, in the first European settlement on the continent in Sydney. Following Sydney, other penal colonies were later established in Tasmania, Queensland, Western Australia. South Australia and Victoria established probably around the 1836 and the 1850 respectively, officially remained free colonies. However, a population that included the thousands of convicts already resided in the area that became known as Victoria. British penal system transported about 162,000 convicts from Great Britain and Ireland to various penal colonies in Australia. So, the Aboriginal people were pushed towards the constant compromise. The arrival of carriers of powerful imperialist culture cost the Aboriginal people their autonomy and the disputed possession of the continent, and it forced them into constant compromise and change as they struggled to accommodate the newcomers. Once European settlement began to expand inland, it conflicted directly with the Aboriginal land tenure and economic activities and entailed the desecration of the Aboriginal scarce sites and property. Clashes marked virtually all situations where conflicting interests were pursued, and the Europeans viewed Aboriginal people as parasites upon nature, defining their culture in wholly negative terms. The frontier was a wild and uncontrolled one for a long period. Aboriginal people in some areas used their superior bushcraft to wage prolonged and effective guerrilla campaigns until they were finally overwhelmed by force of arms. In the period of pacification by force up till the 1880s, a large number of Aboriginal people were killed. Others were driven into the bush, remaining in small pockets subject to the civilization influence of missions, or were left to fend for themselves in the fringe settlements of cities and towns. Still others remained in camps or pastorals and cattle stations to become the core of the labor force. Induced diseases enacted a terrible toll and probably killed many more Aboriginal people than did direct conflict. The disappearance of Aboriginal people in Australia was so rapid that the belief arose that all would soon die out. So what did this lead to? Humanitarian concerns, which led the Australian colonies to pass laws, beginning in 1856 in Victoria, concerning the care and protection of the Aboriginal people. The Aboriginal people were kept off their land and were therefore unable to survive by hunting and gathering. Those who survived their drawn, often forcibly, always incomprehensibly into wretched poverty on the margins of life in the developing colonies. Armed conflict was superseded by a more passive but nonetheless determined opposition to cultural absorption by the invaders. Forced adaptation entailed impoverishment. Armed conflict was superseded by a more passive but nonetheless a determined opposition to cultural absorption by the invaders. Forced adaptation entailed impoverishment over material and cultural, but no alternatives were left. Gradually, missionaries and government's welfare agents began to have some effect, and questions of human treatment came to have a more practical meaning. But in outlying areas, maltreatment, violence, and the forced removal of children of mixed descent lingered on beyond the 1940s. Further, wherever European settlement was intensive, misconfederation took place, and Aboriginal people of mixed descent eventually outnumbered those with full Aboriginal ancestry in southern and eastern Australia. Reserves were established in the late 1920s and early 30s to serve as a buffer between Aboriginal people and Europeans, but many were attracted to or forced into the fringe settlement, where they formed tribally and linguistically mixed communities. This meant the emergence of a new form of living structurally linked to the wide Australian society. Their traditional life ceased to exist as a living reality over much of its southern western, southern eastern, middle eastern areas of the continent through Continuities with the past remain important in the values and the modes of behaviors surrounding kinship and social relations. And at the turn of the 21st century, there was a strong emphasis on cultural revival. In the central and the northern regions, traditional life remained, even on some pastoral mission and government stations, although in a modified form. In the late 20th century, there were growing calls for the Australian government to apologize to the Aboriginal people for abuses they had suffered under early administration. For decades, the government resisted releasing such a statement, but in 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued a formal apology for the past mistreatment of Aboriginal people. I would like you to watch here. So what appeared as a major breakthrough? In October 2023, the government of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese staged a national referendum on whether the Australian Constitution should be altered to formally recognize Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people and to create an Indigenous body, the Voice to Parliament, to advise the government on policies that affect them. Many Indigenous Australians campaigned for the yes vote, hoping it would deliver a better outcome for their communities, which continued to face disproportionately higher rates of incarceration and other systemic socio-economic disadvantage due to the legacy of colonization. Turned out with a tragic end. Yes, in a vote, 60% of those who participated rejected the proposal, and it failed to gain majority support in all 6 states. The result was a stunning blow for the country's Indigenous people. So, is Australia in line with International Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was endorsed by Australia in 2009, recognizes that Indigenous people have the right to participate in decision-making in matters that would affect their rights and that government should consult with Indigenous people before making laws that affect them. It is a blight in Australia's history that successive governments of various political persuasions have failed to uphold the rights of First Nation people. Will there be a forever settlement to this outcry? You are not our king. You are not our sovereign. This is what the senator has to say post the incident. Speaking outside the Parliament House, Thorpe told reporters, "We will continue to resist the colony until we have peacemaking treaty where we can celebrate this country together. We don't need a king from another country to dictate to us what we do here." Thorpe told that she did not interrupt the king's speech, but respectfully waited until the end. There's thousands of massacre sites in the country from invasion, and someone needs to answer for that, Thorpe said. If he is the successor, then he needs to answer. Now, with the slow death of the British monarchy and its presence in Australia, will the slow death of the British monarchy and its presence in Australia, will it give what the First Nation people have been long waiting for? I will leave you with that question. Until then, look after yourself. I will see you in another episode of Goodness. Thank you.
Civil society groups have
Position
been
as far as the pandemic situation is concerned.
Sri Lanka
There was no evidence. There was no science evidence.
Only cremation was introduced as the form of disposal of the body.
I don't think anywhere in the world they did PCR on dead bodies.
They are asking for their last rights. Their last right you are taking away for politics.
வீட்டிலேருந்து எங்கள் பிள்ளைக்கு எப்படி வந்துடுறதால் கேட்டது கேள்வி அவங்களுக்கு பதில் இல்லை. ஐசியில் தான் போடணும், உங்களுக்கு வந்து பார்க்கறதுக்கு மேலானு தான் சொன்னாங்க.
For some reason, you marginalize them. The state vehemently objected.
Some of the things that we discussed and some of the things that were in the minutes were different.
They were going against the science and they were arguing on the basis of politics.
So because of this disease, other people's lives are in threat. That means we need to look into it. But we need to have very, solid evidence for that.
If the global standards and global institutes can get his advice, why can't we get his advice?
You have referred this subcommittee's report to the main committee, but the main committee chooses to ignore the experts.
When it has become the law of the land, it is the law.
Anyway, someday I'm going to die. But I don't want to die and get burned myself.
It was a blatant violation of the principles of science.